Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with our second episode on St. Hildegard of Bingen. St. Hildegard was a mystic, an anointed prophet, a reformer, theologian, poet, composer, abbess, teacher, and Pope-endorsed preacher. In addition to her music, her written legacy includes 58 sermons, commentaries on the Gospels, on the Athanasian Creed, and on the Rule of St. Benedict. She wrote a few lives of medieval saints, in particular the founders of monasteries, and we have over 300 letters of advice, spiritual direction, consolation, and answering questions. She wrote to the King and Queen of England, and to St. Thomas Becket right before they killed him. She scolded the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who was harassing the Pope, threatening him with judgment from God, as if God was speaking through her like an Old Testament prophet. She wrote several books, including a 2-volume set called The Subtleties of the Diverse Nature of Created Things. The first volume is called The Book of Simple Medicine, or the Physica, and the second volume is called The Book of Compound Medicine, or Causes and Cures. This was meant to be a medical guide for curing illnesses. Now, in large part, it's based on medieval medical theories like the humors, but it includes a lot of what you might call the state-of-the-art of herbal cures with recipes. Probably her most famous writings are her theological trilogy of books, which were based on her visions. She said her visions were the result of what she called the shadow of the living light, umbra viventis luminis in Latin. Of course, the living light is God, and even experiencing the shadow of the living light meant being in the presence of an almost unbearably bright light. And it was in this light that she experienced her visions and heard the melodies which she would write down and arrange for her communities to sing. The first of the 3 books is the Scivias, which is shorthand for the actual title Scito Vias Domini, or Know the Ways of the Lord. It took her 10 years to dictate this from her visions, from 1141 to 1151. The second book is the Book of the Merits of Life, which actually outlined vices to be avoided. And then the third book is the Book of the Divine Works, which outlined the corresponding opposite virtues to be practiced. That book also took 10 years to get it all out, from 1163 to 1173. This is how Hildegard begins the Scivias. Look with me. In the 43rd year of my earthly journey, a vision from heaven filled me with such awe it made me tremble. As I watched, out of its brightness, a divine voice spoke to me. How fragile you are, human, made of dust and grime. Articulate what you see and hear. Write it all down, because you're frightened to speak out, and because your style is simple and unschooled, you must write down exactly what God shows and tells you, without relying on human rhetoric or intelligence. Let the will of Him who guides the universe guide you in this work. Get to it. Speak of these visions. In the 1141st year of the incarnation of Jesus, Son of God, when I was 42 years and 7 months old, something exploded like lightning from heaven in my mind, blinding me. It consumed my thoughts, warming my heart without burning, as the sun's rays warm whatever they touch. All of a sudden, I understood what the Psalms meant, what the evangelists wrote, and the meaning of all the other Old and New Testament books, even though my grammar was no good, since I lacked all formal instruction. I've always had visions, even in my childhood, but I kept silent. Later, I told these to only a very few in my monastic family. I've mostly kept them hidden until now, when God decided I should speak out. I did not see these visions when I was asleep or dreaming, nor was I hallucinating. I didn't see them with my physical eyes, nor did I hear them with the ears on the sides of my face. They never came from simple seeing or hearing. No, I was fully awake, and I saw them with my mind. I heard them through my inner ears. This was God's will. It may be hard for you to understand, but it's true. When I reached the age of accountability, a divine voice saying to me, "I am the living light. I make the darkness day, and I have chosen you to see great wonders, though I've humbled you on earth. You are often depressed and timid, and you're very insecure. Because you're conscientious, you feel guilty, and chronic physical pain has thoroughly scarred you. But the deep mysteries of God have saturated you too, as has humility. So now you must give others an intelligible account of what you see with your inner eye and what you hear with your inner ear. As a result, others will learn to know their Creator. They'll no longer refuse to adore God." That voice made me, a heartbroken, fragile creature, begin to write. Though my hand was shaking and I was traumatized by more illnesses than I could even begin to name, as I started this task, I looked to the living light, asking, "But what should I write down?" And that brightness commanded, "Be simple, be pure. Write down what you see and hear." Notice how it has a similar feel to the vision recorded in the book of Revelation. Hildegard then goes on to outline the scope of salvation history by describing her visions one by one, and then recounting what the voice of the divine light said to her by way of explanation. In her visions, she saw the fall of Lucifer, and then the fall of Adam and Eve. She saw how the Old Testament prophecies anticipate the Catholic faith. She saw mystical insights into the Trinity, the Church, and the sacraments, and the virtues. As a true mystic, she makes the connection between the sacrament of matrimony and the mystical union between the soul and its groom, Jesus Christ. And much like the book of Revelation, she saw the trajectory of time and history and the end of all things. Just to give you an example, here's an excerpt from her vision of the second coming of Christ. "After this I looked, and behold, all the elements and all creation were set into motion. Fire, air, and water erupted and made the earth shudder. Thunder and lightning crashed, mountains and forests fell, so that all living things gave up their breath, and all the elements were purged, so that whatever had been corrupt in them vanished and no longer appeared. And I heard the loudest voice ever heard, sounding through the whole earth, saying, 'O children of Adam, who are lying in the earth, all rise.' And behold, human bones, in whatever part of the earth they lay, were reassembled as in a moment, and clothed in flesh. And all people arose, complete in their bodies of either sex, the good shining brightly, and the evil appearing in darkness, so that every person's works were openly seen in them. And some of them had been signed in the faith, but some had not. And some of the signed had what appeared to be a golden brilliance shining from their faces. Others had something like a shadow, because that was their sign. But suddenly from the east a very great brilliance shone forth, and there in the clouds I saw the Son of Man coming, in the same form he had in the world, with open wounds, and with the choirs of angels, and sitting on a throne of flame that warmed but did not burn. And beneath him was this great purgation of the world, and those who were signed were caught up in the air to meet him, as in a whirlwind, where I previously saw the splendor that indicates the secrets of the supernal Creator. With the good separated from the evil, he spoke with a gentle voice, as the Gospel says, "Blessed are the just in the celestial kingdom." But with a frightening voice, he delivered the unjust to infernal suffering, as it is written, with no questions or answers being given about their deeds, except as it is written in the Gospel, since whether the works of each were good or bad was immediately apparent. Those who were not signed stood afar in the northern quarter with the demonic hordes, and they did not come to the judgment, but they all, as in a whirlwind, seeing the end, awaited their judgment, and uttered bitter groans among themselves. And so, when the judgment was finished, the thunder and lightning and wind and storm ceased, and whatever was transitory in the elements suddenly vanished, and an immense calm descended. As you can see, Hildegard's visions could be downright apocalyptic, and she did not shy away from bringing apocalyptic and eschatological themes into her preaching as well, often directing her fire and brimstone at the leaders of the church, whom she criticized for failing in their duties. St. Hildegard saw her own time as a time of great confusion, even frustration, and a time of a lack of trust in the church and her hierarchy. She referred to this as the church going through a time of weakness. She said, "Today, the Catholic faith is in a state of agitation on a global scale. The gospel limps its way around the world. The early church fathers, who wrote so well, are ignored. People are apathetic. They refuse to read and taste the nourishment in the scriptures." Like many medieval people, she thought that maybe these were signs that the return of Christ was near. But God said this to her in a vision: "Everything on earth is hurrying to its end. The world's troubles and its many disasters tell you this. But my Son's bride, the church, will never be destroyed, no matter how many times she's assaulted. At the end of time, she'll be stronger, more beautiful, more magnificent than ever before." Hildegard often wrote as if God was speaking in the first person. And as I mentioned in the last episode, some of what Hildegard wrote was directed at the errors of the Cathars, a heretical sect that was the medieval version of the Gnostics. They rejected marriage, denigrated the basic goodness of the human body, and they denied the doctrine of the Trinity and the Eucharist. In response, Hildegard wrote of a beautiful analogy to demonstrate the miracle of transubstantiation. Writing as though speaking in the voice of God the Father, she said, "In the same miraculous way that my Son took on human flesh in the womb of the Virgin, this oblation changes on the altar. It's a miracle. You've watched a butterfly climb out of a cocoon, unfurl its wings, and fly away from its chrysalis, leaving it behind. In the Eucharistic offering, the bread and wine also undergo a change into my Son's body and blood." I love that analogy, and I think maybe it could help us explain the miracle of the real presence of the body and blood of Jesus to people who have a hard time understanding it. Perhaps the accidents of bread and wine are like a cocoon for the substance of the body and blood which we receive. I also want to read a bit from the lyrics of a couple of her musical compositions. Even translated into English, you get the sense of the beauty of her poetry. This is from one of her many antiphons in praise of the Blessed Virgin Mary, called "O Most Splendid Jewel." O most splendid sparkling jewel, clear beauty, bright light of the sun, which was poured into you and flows through you like a fountain from the Father's heart. This was the Word, through whom the Father created the world's first matter, which was overturned by Eve. In you the Father fashioned this Word as a man, and so you are that clear jewel through whom this very Word exhaled all virtues, as he brought forth all creatures from primal matter. And this from another song in praise of the Virgin called O Greenest Branch. And that word for branch in Latin is virga, so it's a play on words with the word for virgin. Hail, O greenest branch, who came forth in the wind of the breath of the questions of the saints. When the time came for you to blossom into flower, Hail Mary was spoken to you. For the warmth of the sun worked in you like the fragrance of balsam, for a beautiful bloom flowered in you, who gave fragrance to all the spices which had been dry, and they appeared in full verdant freshness. From this the heavens dropped a dew upon the grass, and the whole earth was made glad, because her womb brought forth wheat, and the birds of the air made their nests in it. Then a banquet was prepared for humanity, with great joy for the banqueters. Therefore, O sweet Virgin, in you no joy is lacking. Though Eve despised all these things, now, however, let there be praise to the Most High. And finally, to highlight how St. Hildegard was a legitimate theologian in her own right, I want to share with you an excerpt from her commentary on the Athanasian Creed. Now, not to go off on a tangent, but just to clarify, the Athanasian Creed, also known as the Quicumque Vult, was most likely not written by St. Athanasius, who would have written it in Greek, but this is probably a Western creed, originally written in Latin. But here is just a small part of Hildegard's take on it. It is believed, therefore, faithfully and in truth, that there is one divinity in three persons, and three persons in one divinity, the one life of eternity. Those who do not believe this shall be rooted out on the day of salvation. O masters and teachers of the people, why are you blind and mute with regard to the inner knowledge of the Scriptures, which God has committed to you? Just as he established the sun, the moon, and the stars, so that rational humanity might recognize and discern the times and seasons, knowledge of the Scriptures has been set before you, so that in them, as if in the light of the sun, you might recognize each and every danger, and so that through your teaching you might shine upon the unbelief of wandering humans, like the moon shining in the shadows of the night. Notice how she not only understands the doctrines in question, but she understands them well enough to criticize those who are not teaching them correctly or at all. She is a teacher of teachers. Hildegard was a mystic, and while she may have wanted to go completely inward and focus her life on contemplative prayer, she really couldn't do that. For one thing, she had the responsibility as the spiritual mother of 2 convents. But perhaps even more important, she knew that the spiritual knowledge that God gave her through contemplative prayer, but mainly through her visions, came with another great responsibility: to be a reformer. And like many of our doctors of the Church, St. Hildegard was a voice of reform. In fact, a prophetic voice, often rebuking emperors and popes, not to mention bishops and other clergy as well as the laity. It's worth pointing out that during a time when the Holy Roman emperors were feuding with the popes, when a pope would excommunicate an emperor, the emperor would try to fire the pope and try to appoint a new one. Now, this never really worked, but the pretenders appointed by the emperors, these are called anti-popes, they actually promoted the very corruptions that our doctors of the Church have been working to oppose, including simony and getting rid of clerical celibacy. Their platform, if you will, was that they intended to allow all these abuses, as if that was progress. To me, it sounds familiar. It's fair to say that in the age of the Church, the Old Testament office of prophet was folded into the office of preaching and teaching, and is usually the prerogative of the bishops. But who watches the watchers, as the saying goes? St. Hildegard was not only a Catholic reformer, she was a true prophet, even in the Old Testament sense of the word. She had that extraordinary spiritual gift of prophecy that St. Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians, and she used it to speak for God and to be a voice for holiness. For this reason, she is called the Teutonic Prophetess. Now, in this context, the word Teutonic just means German. She's the German prophetess. And she's also called the Sibyl of the Rhine. Now, for me, this title doesn't really do her justice, because originally, the concept of a sibyl is a pagan oracle. And as I mentioned, too often Hildegard is co-opted by neo-pagans as if she is one of their own, which of course she is not. But at the end of the day, she is one of our doctors of the church, and she did have this special gift of prophecy, which goes beyond the regular wisdom and insights that come from being a genius or even an ordinary saint. She was a genius and a saint, but she was also anointed by the Holy Spirit to speak for God. St. Hildegard of Bingen is actually the fourth woman to be proclaimed a doctor of the Church. But all four of them were named doctors after Vatican II, meaning that before the 20th century, there were no female doctors of the Church. Is that because it was only in the 20th century that we became enlightened enough to see women as equal to men in holiness and intelligence? No, it doesn't mean that. There were, of course, women saints. And even among the church fathers, there are some church mothers. Far from suppressing the writings of women, the church has celebrated those female saints who left us writings in their own words. But these are rare. Nevertheless, part of what makes a person a doctor of the church is that they did leave a written legacy of teaching beyond their own personal sphere. And St. Hildegard, like the other female doctors, are worthy to be in the category of timeless teachers in the church. The very idea that a woman could be recognized as teaching men, well, admittedly, that seems to push the boundaries of St. Paul's advice. And Thomas Aquinas wrote that women should not teach publicly. And in general, this advice that runs from Paul to Aquinas has been kept in the church. But there have been exceptions, and Hildegard is one of them. To be clear, Hildegard preached in public, but not in the liturgy. She did not give homilies at Mass. Therefore, since the clergy are all men, that means that a female teacher is always going to be an exception to the rule. And maybe that's the answer to the question why it took until the 20th century to recognize these few women who were universal teachers so long ago. It's because until the 20th century, we didn't really have a normative contemporary parallel. In other words, what women could emulate these female saints as teachers, or indeed as intellectuals, that path wasn't really open to women. But with the 20th century, we saw the emergence of lay women who can be professors, even seminary professors, authors, and spiritual directors. And so now there is a path open to women to follow in the footsteps of a female medieval saint and teacher. St. Hildegard was a teacher even of men, not because she had that official position, but because God spoke through her as a prophet, and because men listened to her and went to her for advice and instruction. And as a teacher and a theologian, her work continues to inspire and edify the church. Within about a generation of her death, her works were already being made into what are called florilegia, which means something like a bouquet of readings. These are readers, excerpts from the spiritual masters written by teachers for their students to read. It's the course pack for the class. Sometimes these were annotated because they were considered difficult to understand, and Hildegard's writings were considered difficult. But the point of all this is that this puts her on a level with the likes of St. Augustine and Peter Lombard, in the sense that teachers thought it was important that their students read collections of the things that she wrote. St. Hildegard was declared a doctor of the Church by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012. Her feast day is September 17th. And I always ask St. Hildegard to pray with me for all the women in my life who suffer from migraines or who are just generally smart and creative. Now, just one more thought about contemporary relevance. It seems that visionaries and prophecies have multiplied in the time since Hildegard, and I don't mean to dismiss any in particular. Personally, I'm partial to St. Padre Pio and St. Faustina. But the thing about Hildegard is that her visions are endorsed by the Church, and she is a doctor of the Church, not because she claimed any special revelation per se, but because her teachings are timeless, and therefore always timely. They are always relevant because they are not confined to her own time or to a particular context. She did have words of knowledge for particular people, but my point is that when it comes to discerning the truth or falsehood of prophetic or apocalyptic voices, we need the discretion of the Church, and we need patience to see which of the visionaries will stand the test of time. Hildegard is one of those who has passed both tests, endorsed by the Church in her own time, and her voice has stood the test of time. So, where should you begin if you want to get to know Hildegard better? I would start with the book by Carmen Acevedo Butcher, Hildegard of Bingen, A Spiritual Reader. Butcher's book includes the morality play, excerpts from her letters, and a selection of her lyrics, as well as excerpts from her theological writings. And, as I mentioned in the last episode, if you've never heard Hildegard's music, do yourself a favor and check that out. All of that is linked in the description. One last thing. There have been some attempts to put Hildegard's music together with contemporary music, usually electronic music. And I know the purists probably won't like it, but I think there is one that's worth at least giving it a listen. It's not simply a mashup of a pre-recorded track of Hildegard over a drum machine. It's recorded specifically for this melding of Hildegard's music with some contemporary instrumentation. It's called Vision, the Music of Hildegard von Bingen, produced by Richard Souther. I like it. You may not, but it's worth giving it a try, especially if you already like electronic music. And I'll link a playlist of that in the description as well. And this brings us to the end for now. And I have to say, Hildegard is one of my favorite doctors of the Church, and I hope you've enjoyed these episodes. Next time on The Way of the Fathers, St. Anthony of Padua. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.